Hi, it's Doug DeVitri with the CoTrackPro podcast. Today, I have a very special guest, Jessica Zadjura. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Doug. I appreciate it.
Well, tell us a little bit about yourself and the different areas of the family ecosystem to which you practice.
Certainly, I am a family law attorney in Maryland. I have been practicing family law for almost 15 years at this point. I handle litigation. I will advocate for a parent where necessary. I also mediate a lot of cases, both through court referrals and privately through, people who find me on Google, other attorney referrals, those sorts of things. I also serve as a child attorney representing children when the court appoints me in that capacity to assist children in custody and divorce cases. And then my last role is as a parent coordinator to help families or parents, make decisions and forward their co-parenting relationship outside of litigation and hopefully to keep them out of litigation in that component.
Wow, that's really great. Now, you come from a background where it's a blended family, right? Where they might your both parents might share different values, and you're also a child like me from d divorce. My parents were divorced. Tell us about how that kind of shaped your professional career and how you work with your clients today.
Yeah, I mean, I was raised in a divorced parent scenario from the time I was very, very little. So, I think it allows me to empathize with the children that are going through the divorce aspect of it, or, even just the breakdown of relationship when the parties aren't married. Um, I also had a stepmom when I was growing up, and even still to this day, who was very involved. And I have half and step siblings. So, I certainly get it from a child aspect from that perspective. And then I actually have a stepson of my own from my marriage. So, I see the nuances from the parent perspective as well and deal with, the fact that co-parents are bringing other adults into the relationship and they don't necessarily, they're not your chosen co-parent, right? You didn't marry that person, but you're still co-parenting with a step parent, for example, and those sorts of things. So I certainly think that having that own personal experience allows me to be more empathetic. It allows me to get a little bit more creative. It allows me to bring my own experience to the table and explain to parties, well, these are some problems I've run into in my own life. Have you thought about X, Y, and Z as a result? And those kinds of things.
Well, that's really great. And one of the things that I liked about your profile is that you're compassionate and no nonsense. I know it seems like two different things. Tell us what that's all about.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I have learned in all of my years of practice is that you can't leave room for misunderstanding when you communicate with people, right? My husband would describe me as very blunt and straightforward, but I think it's, just a matter of I want to make sure we're all on the same page. I want to make sure we're communicating appropriately, those sorts of things. So I think that's kind of where my no nonsense attitude really kind of comes from. I also have been practicing in the family law arena for a very long time. So I'm very familiar with it. I'm very comfortable. And I don't, as an attorney, I don't have a lot of patience for wasting my clients' money or my own personal time because there's not a lot of it, right? For either one. When parties are divorcing, they're not only just dividing their household, they're creating duplicates of every expense. And I acknowledge that my role as an attorney is often very expensive for my client, and so I take a very, kind of get in and get out approach. I'm not going to send this lengthy verbose email if I don't absolutely have to, not because I'm not, trying to do less work or anything of that nature, but I think that's my no nonsense attitude, right? Like, I, can I say the same thing and cost my client less at the very same amount of time? So,
Well, sure. And there's a lot of duplicate tasks that happen because you have to do it for both sides. And in that process, to probably save some of that time, both for your clients and for yourself, there's a lot of healing that has to happen, right?
yeah,
Tell
I
us
mean,
your experience, what that looks like.
as a family law attorney, you often almost play a pseudo therapist role without having that training. And certainly, I don't discount what therapists do. I could not do that for a living. But, people are, mourning the death of a relationship as they're getting divorced, while also trying to do what they think is best for their children. And it is a very emotional process. And a lot of what I do is listening to people and holding space for those emotions and trying to, honor them. That sounds very woo woo as I say it out loud, right? But like trying to make sure that, I guide people in a manner that feels genuine to them, but also leaves them with realistic expectations if they can't reach a resolution with their co-parent and we have to go to court. Hopefully that made sense. I think, you know, trying to make sure that a party's emotions don't drive their litigation is very important. So listening to them, giving them time to talk to me about that, and finding a way to reframe that and potentially a solution that could align with what's going to happen in court, is very important to me. But I also have to recognize that anger, sadness, bitterness, disdain, those sorts of things for their co-parent isn't the sole reason that we're going to court, because in my experience, nobody's ever happy. Going to court, letting a judge decide for your children doesn't resolve those emotions. In fact, sometimes reaching a resolution amongst yourselves and stopping that process and not having to go through that adversarial process with your co-parent allows those emotions to heal. And really kind of trying to help people understand that in my litigation practice is very important. And I think that applies to mediation and parent coordination as well.
No, that's really great. I mean, there's two sides of it, right? There's resolution and then there's winning, getting everything that you want.
There is no winning in family law. No winning. There are only losers. And the only people that really suffer or suffer the worst are the children, and trying to kind of remind people that, the children, the longer the fighting goes on in many instances, the harder it is for the children, because mom and dad's co-parenting relationship is very stressful. It's very tense. It's, they can't sit next to each other at their kids' soccer game, for example, when the litigation is happening. And getting people to realize that healing happens after the fact and not during is sometimes part of the hardest thing that I do. But there's absolutely no winning in family law. The only people that win in family law is the attorneys, because
Yeah.
they make all the money. I mean, there are judges and magistrates in Maryland that will tell you that. And they will start a trial off by saying, the only winners in this are the family law attorneys, because you're paying to put their kids through school instead of keeping that money in your own pocket. And I mean, it applies to mediation, it applies to parent coordination too, right? The more, parents butt heads with one another, the less the kids win, right? The kids become
Yeah.
the losers in that scenario. And it's very, very hard on them. And, reminding people that being right isn't everything, even if you are really, truly right. And obviously, there is a line for everything. Sometimes you have to litigate because you can't reach a resolution, right? But, getting people to understand that, you know, in 10 years, those small details probably aren't going to matter, whether little Johnny played t-ball or he played soccer at age 3. Like, okay, he got socialization, he got outside to do some sort of extracurricular activity. I'm a parent. My child's not sitting in front of a screen. Those are all the wins. It doesn't matter if he plays t-ball or if he plays, just to be right, or just because your co-parent said the sky is blue, you need to say the sky is green, kind of thing. So, reminding people that the child's not going to remember which parent chose which activity, or whatever the hang up is, in 10, 15, 20 years is, half the battle sometimes.
Well, you've been recognized as a super lawyer, right? Which is like top 5% of lawyers. You're also a professor at a local community college. What do you think sets apart your advocacy in representing families?
Um, what separates my advocacy? That's a great question.
There's a lot of people I could probably, I'm not from Maryland, right? I'm here in Missouri, but if I was going to Maryland, why would I hire you?
I mean, I think the fact that, I have experience not just as an attorney, right, but from my own personal experience, and how long I've been doing this is one of the things that sets me apart, because I can empathize and I can relate, and I am, um oftentimes coming from a similar background that these parties are coming from, I think that really gives me a lot of, credence and a lot of, what's the word I'm looking for? They can buy into what I'm saying, right? Because it is my own personal experience. And I
Mhm.
can say, here are the pros and cons that I've lived with, or here's how I've seen this go, negatively or positively. It really helps parties. And I think that's one of the big things that I bring to the table. I also think my thirst for knowledge, if that makes sense, is very, very helpful in what I do. I'm always, you know, talking to people and asking a lot of questions from other professionals, whether it be a therapist or a mortgage broker or a financial advisor or, whomever the case may be, because the more knowledge I have in more areas, the more resources and the more help I can provide my clients, right? Because it's not just the kids and it's not just what happens in this divorce case or this custody case, right? Like these people have to go on and live their lives after the fact. And I want to make sure that whatever assets they're taking out of the case, for example, are serving them best for the next 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years until they retire. And they are growing that to the best of their ability. And that, their child is set up for success if they need an IEP. Have they gotten a therapist involved? Have they done this? Have they thought about this resource? All of those sorts of things. So I try to, they're not just a number to me. They're people in my community. They are, a parent, at my child's school potentially. These people matter, right? They're
Mhm.
not just, money for me. And so I think that's one of the things that I really kind of bring to the table too.
That's really great, and I appreciate the sense of community and involving all the different professionals because at some point you might have to tap into one of them for to help out a family in need.
Yeah.
Um, Tell me about a parenting coordinator, right? We've heard that term kind of flopped around. No one's on our podcast has really gone into depth of a parenting coordinator. Tell us what that is. When do you need one? And everything else.
Yeah. So every state is different, and I can certainly only speak to Maryland, right? Because this is the only place I'm licensed. But parent coordination in Maryland is intended to help the parties either during a custody case or after an order for custody has been entered. And it's really intended to help them navigate the day to day. So what happens is the court will refer families to a parent coordinator, and the parent coordinator is not intended to advocate for either party. Their job is to be neutral, and they can assist the party in making day-to-day decisions. If they need to have minor tweaks for their holiday schedule, for example, and they can't, reach a resolution amongst themselves, the parent coordinator is there to help make a decision. And sometimes the decision comes down in mom's favor, and sometimes the decision comes down in dad's favor, and sometimes the decision's down the middle somewhere and not really towards either side. But to say, okay, we're going to exchange on Christmas Day at 4 p.m. instead of the next day because, the child's maternal grandmother is in town and she hasn't seen her for 3 years, or or whatever the little nuance is.
Sure.
So that the parties aren't continuously running back to court and fighting in the courthouse over all of these minor little things that candidly by the time they get to the courthouse the issue is going to be well over with, right? Do we go with orthodontist A or orthodontist B? And they're both in network, but one takes payment plans and another doesn't, and a parent really needs the payment plans. Like, how do you decide that when one parent decides they have to be right or the other parent has to be wrong in those particular instances, right? So they can help kind of grease the squeaky wheels on those sorts of things. They can also suggest resources. If the family has a child that's recently been diagnosed with autism, for example, they, can say, well, have you thought about contacting this particular organization to see what resources are out there? And or have you thought about talking to their school and working for an IEP or a 504, those sorts of things as well. So in Maryland, that can come either during the course of litigation or after litigation. And it's not uncommon for the courts to order a parent coordinator here in Maryland after litigation to help them, with those day-to-day nuances. Dad wants to go travel and he wants to take a 2-week vacation with the child this year instead of a 1 week. And he's going to do all these really great educational things. And mom says, well, the order says dad only gets 1 week of vacation. Okay, I hear you, but maybe we need to have a conversation about how this might look or how mom might get some of her time back to make up for that extra week of vacation, as opposed to just straight out saying no, because there is a benefit for the child, for example. So it helps them also on the back end after an order's been put in place to implement and understand the terms of the order. And a parent coordinator doesn't have to be an attorney. It can also be a mental health professional. We have specific training that we're required to take here in Maryland, and certain continuing education requirements that we have to do in order to maintain our spot on the court's list of parent coordinators.
Gosh, it seems like a tremendous responsibility to be the umpire for, I don't know how many hundreds of decisions that happen in the course of a year.
Some parents come all the time because there's a cost associated, right? So sometimes the parent coordinator role is very minimal because the parties say, well, we can either figure it out amongst ourselves or now we have to pay this professional to assist us in coming to it. So sometimes there is that kind of cost incentive to force is not a good word, but to incentivize the parties to work together a little harder than they might otherwise do so. And so there's certainly a benefit from that perspective as well.
Yeah, that's really great. I can see how that can come in handy in multiple scenarios. What are some of the tools that you use to help keep all of this organized, right? Because just one family, there's just all these things going on. Is there any one tool or a couple of tools that help you stay productive?
I think over, almost 15 years of practicing, I've really kind of honed my systems and, crafted a client management software that works the way I need to. And, I'm very diligent. I'm very organized. I have hundreds and hundreds of lists all over the place. And, I have a list and then I rewrite the list and all of those kinds of things. So I just think it comes from years of experience. I'm very type A, so I'm sure that probably also plays into it. Um, so I mean, I wouldn't say that there is any one system. It's more just, from having done this a long time, that some of those things become very innate,
Mhm.
right? And having good support staff as an attorney and as a mediator, and knowing that they are implementing the systems that I have created, and having some level of trust from there, and those sorts of checks and balances.
Yeah, that's really great. And one of the things I noticed is that you're deep into community service with is it the Maryland Association of Justice?
Yeah, the Maryland Association of Justice, or for Justice, is a bar association here in the state of Maryland. They have various different sub chapters within them. I am the co-chair of the Family Law Division of the Maryland Association of Justice. And my role there is to provide educational opportunities to other attorneys throughout the state that are also part of this bar association. So this year we're putting on some lunch and learns. We're doing a half day event in the spring that will involve some of the judges and magistrates on a panel to educate, because the legislature changes the laws almost annually in many areas, and family law touches on so many things. We deal with restructuring of businesses, we deal with the sale of real estate, we deal with all sorts of mental health. Sometimes there are criminal components of the cases we handle, immigration components. There's a lot of financial aspect of what we do. So really kind of staying knowledgeable in all sorts of different, topics and practices of law is very important. And, it's important to me to make sure that the younger attorneys, and even some of the more seasoned attorneys, you know, are aware of what's going on, because we live in this ever-changing landscape. And October 1's right around the corner. That's usually when they implement our new laws here in the state of Maryland, and there's some very big changes coming this year, so making sure that everyone is aware of them and
Sure.
talking to the judiciary about how those changes might look for us attorneys that are litigating cases right, as we start to go down that road towards those new laws taking effect. So that's very important to me.
Yeah, that's such an important discussion to stay connected to the judiciary, right? To actually let
Yeah,
them.
and understanding how the new laws from their perspective, because they're the ones who are interpreting them, right, and applying them to our cases. That's their role. So understanding their mindset allows us attorneys to better advocate and better advise our clients throughout the litigation process.
Well, what are you most excited about as far as the future of family law is considered?
Um, I think there is a big push towards, you know, giving families every opportunity to try to work together and resolve their cases without the need for a judge to get involved. There's something to be said for having control over when your child spends his or her time with each parent. And, there's kind of the running joke in family law and probably in a lot of types of negotiation that, you know, the best agreement is one where nobody is happy. You can't get 100% of what you want when you advocate, and when you negotiate, right? No business can, no human can. Like, that's just not the way a negotiation works, right? You're never going to get 100% of what you want. But there is something to be said for having control and putting in all of the detail. The court deals with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cases on a daily basis and on a yearly basis, right? They don't have the time or the ability, right, to sit down and deal with every single solitary little detail. And that doesn't mean what the courts are doing is wrong, but
Mhm.
some families need that. And, trying to appeal to clients or the parties to the litigation and getting them to understand that if your case needs this, especially, it's important to have control over it and have some sort of say, because when you go to a judge, you may get nothing of what you're asking for. Now, the other side may get nothing too, which maybe that's the win. I don't really know. But, there is something to be said for having control and knowing what your future looks like as a co-parent, as opposed to, leaving it up to some person who doesn't know or love your child the way that you do, right? Um, there's also a lot of benefit because the courts can only tell families in their orders, you know, they have limitations, right, on what they can order. The parties can agree to things that the court never has authority over, that they may not get creative and do. And so, that sometimes is also very beneficial to parties. And so seeing the court and the legal system start making sure that the parties have these opportunities and being more vocal with the attorneys in, you guys really have a lot of the heavy lifting to do, but it's really beneficial to society as a whole in, making sure these parties are trying to work together. And sometimes it doesn't work, right? But I mean, seeing from when I started 15 years ago to now, I mean, you see a lot more cases settle, I think, and a lot more attorneys, family law attorneys, that are much more open and receptive to the mediation process, as opposed to just litigate, 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 litigate. This is a very kind of an old school way of practicing family law. And again, sometimes it's necessary, but I think you're seeing a lot more attorneys that are buying into the, more collaborative approaches, for lack of a better word.
That's so great. You've got so many resources to there to share, I imagine. How would you recommend people following up with you?
They can certainly go to my website, ZadjuraFamilyLaw.com. I can also be found on LinkedIn. The firm has a Facebook page and an Instagram page as well. But they can always reach me in any one of those channels.
And would you say what would say is the one resource that co-parents should go out and get to help them if they're just starting out?
I really think that your communication apps like Our Family Wizard, App Close, those sorts of things, really help streamline communications for parties who have difficulty communicating with one another. And because it helps them stay organized, Our Family Wizard, and I'm not wed to that by any means, but it's really the most popular of the communication tools for co-parents, it has an AI feature that will tell you whether or not you're being too snarky or you're being too rude, or, will flag, foul language or inflammatory language and those sorts of things, which we're all human, right? Like I say things to my husband, families argue whether they're intact or they're separate, right? But, sometimes having that check at the door is helpful to fostering a good co-parenting relationship. But, those apps allow you to have a shared calendar without really
Yeah.
sharing a calendar, right? Like people get very uncomfortable about sharing their Google calendar or their work calendar or whatever. They have a shared calendar where you can put the child's activities and school schedule and custody schedules and all of those sorts of things. You can exchange receipts that way. You can not FaceTime, video chat with the child through Our Family Wizard these days. You can reimburse one another for shared expenses, all of those sorts of things. So really kind of, you know, giving them the tools to better communicate with one another is really helpful. And it cuts down on did dad send me that via email, or did he send it to me via text message, or did he call me on the phone, right? Like everything is all in one place, and it's an app, right? Like we all carry around our cell phones. I got two of them, candidly, right? Like it's an app on your phone. You can use it. It gets notifications. You don't have to respond to it necessarily right away unless it's an emergency, but everything for your child is all in one place. And when you get to like my kid's age, I have a teenager, my stepson's a teenager, he can have the ability to go in and see his calendar. He can have the ability to, add things to that calendar, know where he's going to be, know when he's going on vacation with mom and might miss a couple extra days with dad, or vice versa, and when they get to that age, it's really kind of great, right? Like that's what they want. They want to have the power and or think they're in control, right? At 13 and 14 and 15, before they're a complete adult. So, these co-parenting apps are really helpful, and they have a lot of great features, and they're constantly adding new features to help families. And again, Our Family Wizard is really just the big one, but there's a lot of free alternatives to them as well that are really, really great.
Well, I can't wait for you to try out some of these CoTrackPro apps because they solve a lot of different problems using AI and really kind of get to the core of the communication and decision making.
Yeah.
But
I
Jessica,
look forward to it. Thank you.
yeah, thank you so much for being a part of the program. I'll make sure that everybody knows how to follow up with you for more information.
Thanks. Thank you for having me, Doug. I really appreciate it.